Welcome back to the Woven Well podcast. Today we have a friend of the show back. Laura Ducote is a fantastic nurse practitioner focusing in on restorative reproductive medicine and a great part of the team at Woven Natural Fertility Care, working with women who are pregnant or postpartum, specifically in educating them along that journey. And we're so glad to have her be here. We talk about all things related to fertility care and restorative reproductive medicine because she is a fertility care practitioner, a family nurse practitioner, and most importantly, a wife and mother of 4 children here on earth. So, welcome back to the show, Laura.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm excited to be back.
We have some pretty fun episodes. We've talked about some great stuff over the years. We've talked about you being a nurse practitioner and your education that you received and how it's different, just like standard medical education versus restorative reproductive medicine. We've talked about low hormones and supplements that can help with that and physical activities that can make a difference. And today I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about insulin resistance because this is one of those things that when I am working with clients, I see come up so often. It can start with the charting. So sometimes I'll have a client come in and I can know almost immediately by looking at their charts that they probably have some sort of glucose or insulin issue. Maybe they have a little bit of mucus all the time. Also, maybe they already know that they have a high A1C, or their doctor has said, like, you're pre-diabetic or it's borderline. And so they're already aware that they have some glucose issues, but they don't know about the insulin side of it. Do you feel like in your patient base, you're seeing a lot of insulin resistance, or is it just my impression, or do you feel like this is something that's really common?
Truly, I do see insulin resistance often, like really often. Even in my patients that they're eating pretty healthy, things like that, um, that I still will sometimes see signs of insulin resistance on the chart or with the other symptoms they're bringing to me, like acne or, feeling like they get even hypoglycemic, that kind of like irritable before meals kind of um, feeling, things like that, where it's like, well, this doesn't match up
Mm.
with you having normal blood sugar, control. So even my thin patient, I really am looking at insulin resistance on truly almost everyone these days.
And you make a really good point that a lot of times, and this is probably through media representation of what glucose and insulin issues are, it's so often associated with weight loss. And so we have this
Mm-hmm.
incorrect association in our mind that only those who are focused on losing weight also need to be interested in glucose and insulin. It's like, no, no, no. Glucose and insulin affect a single human being on the planet, and we really need to be learning about it and being on the lookout for any issues that we can have. So you can't
Mm-hmm.
disqualify yourself and say, oh, no, that's not going to be an issue for me because I'm not trying to lose weight. You don't have to
Right.
be in that category at all. And you also don't have to have PCOS. Although
True.
we do know there is a strong relationship with those who have insulin resistance issues and those who are diagnosed with PCOS. You want to share a little bit maybe about that relationship or what you see?
Yeah. A lot of times the reason insulin resistance and PCOS are related is because what insulin will do when it's running on the higher side than what it technically is should be for the body is it will affect the ovary in such a way that it creates more testosterone. Testosterone also converts into estrogen. So then you get this environment inside the ovary where there's a higher, a hyperandrogen like state inside the ovary, which then creates an estrogen dominance. Both of those things are typically common in the PCOS patient. And so what happens is you get a lot of little follicles, or what they call in PCOS polycystic ovarian syndrome. Um, and so you end up with a lot of these little follicles that are these cyst like structures. It's different than what people hear about with an ovarian cyst that's like a painful cyst that may burst or something like that. PCOS and ovarian cysts can be two totally different things. The PCOS environment inside the ovary is basically where that insulin resistance then creates a higher testosterone environment, which then creates larger amounts of cysts in there and then disrupts the body's ability to be able to ovulate properly. Kind of, if you want to think about it, by having a little bit more to choose from, if you want to think about it that way. Like there's more little cysts in there that the body's almost like confused. Which one do I choose to ovulate this month? How am I going to decide between all of these follicles to choose from? And it just creates a different environment that can affect ovulation and even delay ovulation is a lot of times what we see.
Yeah, and people don't often realize that there would be a connection between something going on with insulin and our reproductive health. But I think you did a great job explaining what one option could be. So you could have PCOS, but even if you don't, having that insulin resistance, which how I've always understood it is there's basically glucose that when you take in sugar or something that will convert to sugar once you eat it, that glucose needs to get into all of our cells. That's the energy that our cells need in order to function. So glucose is a good thing, but always in moderation. And so in order to get into the cell to help it function, insulin is the key that will open the door to the cell to allow that energy to go in. So you want insulin, you want glucose, but you want them to be in a really good relationship. If the key isn't working, then insulin will be produced more so than necessary. Or if glucose levels are really high, then there's also going to be an overproduction of insulin. And in both of those situations, you've got all this leftover insulin and it's going to have an effect on the body.
That's exactly right. One of the ways that I describe it to my patients sometimes when we're talking about insulin resistance is almost like that receptor that you talked about, the glucose receptor that's on all of our cells. It's almost like an insulin resistance, they're wearing earmuffs. And so the pancreas that makes insulin has to shout at that receptor to say, let's open up the gate, that key to let the glucose come into the cell. And so you end up with all this extra insulin that the body technically shouldn't need if we took those earmuffs off, if that insulin resistance was not there. And so this extra insulin can be very inflammatory for the body. It also is interesting because the cells of the ovary
Mm,
are not insulin resistant. They have a different type of receptor. And so
interesting.
every other part of the body has those earmuffs on, but then the ovary is hearing this extra insulin like you are shouting at it. And so it truly does disrupt the reproductive hormones inside the ovary even more than we realize.
Wow.
The other piece is that I mentioned is the inflammation. And we just don't honestly give inflammation enough credit these days. We could do an entire episode on inflammation. But anytime there's extra inflammation in the body, it's going to cause disruption, like, wherever it's found.
Hmm.
I kind of think about it almost in like the top tier hormones and blood sugar and insulin because those are necessary for survival. We know that we have to eat, we have to take in glucose to our cells to have energy for our bodies to move and do whatever it needs to do. We know those are top tier hormones. So I think we have to recognize that they are naturally going to affect everything down the line if they're not in the proper balance.
Yes, I'm envisioning this like waterfall, this cascading effect that if it's too much, it's going to overwhelm everything else. And even the inflammation, like, gosh,
Yeah.
thinking about how inflammation contributes to the development of autoimmune diseases and the progressing of things like endometriosis. And so it's just going to compound. The issues will just continue to grow and get bigger or more challenging, and it could be improved by just looking at this insulin. So, is there a way to take the earmuffs off? Like, is there a way to improve insulin resistance?
So sometimes insulin resistance can be somewhat managed. Like you can help your body become more insulin sensitive by doing some different things. But I will say that sometimes once we find insulin resistance, there can be like genetic components to why insulin resistance is already there,
Yeah.
or environmental things. There can be all sorts of reasons why we end up finding insulin resistance. And like I said, I'm finding it even in some of my younger patients that have not done anything that you would have expected, would bring insulin resistance about. I think we think about, making bad choices that lead to prediabetes or something, but that's not necessarily what I see.
Mm,
And so in that case, I don't know that the thought process should be reversing it or like taking it away, but just learning that your body needs help to become more insulin sensitive, because insulin resistance is technically something that will be progressive over time. And as I started to learn more and more about insulin resistance, I honestly truly felt like it was the reason that the Lord brought me from working in cardiac, like that's what my nursing background is, to women's health and restorative reproductive medicine. I feel like it is such a primary women's health issue that's being overlooked and way underdiagnosed. And when I left the ICU, I decided I applied for family nurse practitioner school. Even though I really thought that I was going to be going down this road, I chose family instead of women's health because I thought, well, at some point in time, I feel like my patients in the cardiac ICU, they just really need a good primary care doctor to help prevent all of this chronic disease that got them to
mm,
this place to need heart surgery. And so in my practice now, I feel like this insulin resistance component is where I see that primary care come into my practice, where it's like, I'm not just helping women's health and hormones. I am helping like your general health for like the long term. Like, I mean, I truly feel like I'm
yes.
preventing heart disease in my
Mm,
patients and keeping them out of the cardiac ICU by doing the work that I do.
wow.
So
Yeah, it makes it so meaningful on another level, you know? I mean, there is so much that's beneficial about restorative reproductive medicine, but it's good to know that it's not even just within the realm of reproductive medicine, but our whole
yeah,
health too. And I think that your guidance there is very important because especially online. Now, listen, we have an Instagram account, so I'm not trying to knock it, okay? But there are so many things that you can find on social media or online in some way that suggests that if you just make lifestyle changes, that's all you need to do. And that could be. You could be in a category where you've been eating in a way, living in a way that is not very nourishing to your body, mind, or soul. And if that's the case, then you are going to have side effects physically, mentally, spiritually. And so one of
hmm
those could be issues with glucose and insulin, and making those changes could take care of it for you or reverse it or, cure it in some way. So I don't want to say you shouldn't do those things. Those foundational things are critical for every one of us as a human being. So do them. But beyond that, I think online you see like if you do this fad diet, if you just cut this one thing out of all of your meals, then you'll be able to reverse insulin resistance. And those things are not sustainable and they're not always accurate. It is important to work with a medical professional who wants to get to the root of it and is going to be honest with you about whether it's just diet and lifestyle or if it looks like there is a genetic component that really needs to be managed even at age 25 so that it doesn't continue to progress and get worse and worse and lead to some pretty nasty diagnoses as you get older.
Yeah, yeah. And not to scare anyone that they're going to have heart surgery if you've been told you have insulin resistance. But at the
No,
same
no, no.
time, just to put forward that there are more things going on than, than we even realize most of the time. And I think as you've said, the lifestyle component is huge.
Yes.
It can be a frustrating process of trial and error, even of like figuring that out for your body, like what
Mm,
works well for your body in terms of managing your blood sugar. Another thing, though, is that I like to do in terms of deciding if we really do need to be working on insulin resistance or not is to just get a proper diagnosis. So, one, I see people get a fasting glucose and then think that they're fine. But as you said, sometimes we're seeing signs on the chart, extra mucus or, delayed peak days, things like that where we're just still really suspicious that insulin resistance may be there. And so a glucose tolerance test can be very helpful to see the full picture, but usually we will also add insulin to that. So you're getting a glucose and an insulin value at fasting, drinking the drink, and then multiple times for the next 2 hours to really get a full picture of what's going on. That can be helpful when the blood sugar is technically still normal because you're young enough that your pancreas is putting out a lot of insulin to compensate. Um, but really, that's where the insulin value comes in. And then also, sometimes we're able to see the pattern is abnormal. It should just be after you drink the drink, it just goes up and then it gradually comes down. And some people, it's just like all over the place. And so that pattern can also be helpful. Um, Once we have that diagnosis, then we can really go from there on if we're going to need a kind of combination of lifestyle supplement or even medication. How severe is this for your body? And then how much time do we have? What's our timeline in terms of what your goals are with why you kind of came to us in the first place? Because if we're looking at time, then sometimes going all three routes may be the fastest. But if we're looking at, a I just really want to have a healthy body and nothing really feels wrong. I just want to make sure that I'm properly taking care of my body. Going a lifestyle route in that way is going to typically take longer, but is typically the best for us overall is to truly be disciplined and to make the changes that our body is basically asking for to feel better.
mm. Yes, and I appreciate you saying that because it goes back to being individualized in the treatment. Every person is different. Every person needs different treatment. So it's not this automatic, oh, you have insulin resistance, you are have to take metformin, or you have to do this injectable, or you have to do whatever. Really looking at your context and what you need for your health now and in the future, but working with somebody who can get to that and walk you through it and talk about it together, invite you to be a part of the conversation instead of just receive a prescription to do something with, is really critical. Well, I appreciate you being on the show, Laura. Thanks for talking about insulin resistance with me. This is something that comes up so often. And if the listeners are interested in working with you and they happen to live in Alabama, then we'll make sure to have a link in the show notes so that they can schedule with you.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin.
As always, thanks for listening as we continue to explore together what it means to be woven well.